always enjoyed my job as a rideshare driver. I won't tell you what I used to do for work before this. Let's just say that's a chapter of my life I'm trying to put behind me. I enjoy having the opportunity to meet different people and share stories during the ride. I actually like to play a little game with myself where I try to imagine things about their lives, and then I try to see what I can find out to prove whether I was right or whether I was dead wrong. I'd say for the most part, I'm usually right. My name is Sharam, and I've been driving for the company for 3 years, building up a list of regular passengers and getting to know the city. It was a cool, crisp October evening. It wasn't full-on raining or like misting, and a fairly thick fog hung in some of the lower portions of town, particularly along the riverbanks. I had just dropped a customer off at their home on the northeast end of the city after running them to the bank before it closed at 6, when I received a ride request from a nearby location. The app displayed the names of the passengers, John and Lynne. I arrived at the pickup spot, and 2 figures emerged from the shadows. John, a tall, imposing man with a cocky grin, immediately came across as arrogant. Lynne, on the other hand, seemed to be putting on a brave face, but I could tell straight away that she was trembling, even though she tried to conceal it as she sat with her head bowed, looking down at the floor. As they settled into the back seat, I couldn't help but feel something was off. They both were wearing sunglasses, but it was already dark outside when I picked them up. John had his arm around Lynne's shoulder, pulling her tight against his side, but the way he was hanging onto her felt more controlling than affectionate. He seemed to be squeezing her pretty tight, and I thought I noticed her wince any time he made any sort of movement. John was fidgety, and from time to time his knees would bump the seat behind me, which was annoying. Seemed like he couldn't find a comfortable position in the seat behind me. I wasn't going to take any crap from this guy. I know his type. I imagined him as a pathetic mommy's boy that didn't like being told no. Although he was tall, I pictured him small, if you know what I mean. I could see him working in an office-type setting, but in a capacity where he didn't have to interact with other people. The way he carried himself seemed to communicate that he thought he was better than everyone else. "My wife and I are in a bit of a hurry," John hissed as he leaned in closer to my left ear. "Can we get going, please?" The please caught me by surprise and disarmed me enough that I followed his orders and put the car in drive. It was just about 7 p.m. now, and in mid-October the days were getting shorter. It was overcast too, which made it darker than it would have normally been around that time of year. John and Lynne had requested to be dropped off down near the river flats on the north shore of the river, just outside of town on the east side. It was about a 20-minute drive, maybe a little more if some people slowed down because of the fog. I remember being thankful that I had that much time to try to make some type of connection with the female and make sure she was okay before I had to drop them off. As we drove, John continued to fidget in his seat. I could feel him watching me as we drove and occasionally glancing back over his shoulder behind us. He seemed to be a bit paranoid. Anytime I looked at him in the rearview mirror, he gave a sleazy smile and his head gestured for me to return my attention back to the road ahead of us. Lynne's head remained bowed, and I wondered how I could safely check in with her without being able to make eye contact. My first idea was to see if I spoke to her directly, if she would look up, so I said, "That's a pretty sweater you're wearing, ma'am. What color is it? Is it like a burgundy, or would you say it's more of a purple?" "It's purple," John said, answering for Lynne, who didn't even attempt to look up when I tried to speak to her. "Oh, okay, cool," I said. "My sister has a sweater like that one, but hers is like a deep red." "Oh, yeah?" said John, as he seemed to squeeze Lynne tighter. "That's nice. How much longer do you think it will take to get there? We're meeting up with some friends and don't want to keep them waiting." "Oh, probably 15 or so," I said, to which he huffed and sounded like a little brat that was too impatient to wait for their car ride to end. This guy annoyed me, and I tried not to laugh at his disgust when I told him how long it would be. I looked down at my speedometer and made sure that I didn't go more than 1 kilometer over the speed limit. I remember thinking that I was going to enjoy watching this jerk squirm. "So, you folks lived here long?" I asked. Again, looking back, trying to make eye contact with Lynne, but she didn't flinch. And John just huffed and turned away to look out the rear passenger window. "I moved here about 3.5 years ago," I said, trying to make it extra awkward for them not to participate in the conversation. "I used to live out west, but things got pretty expensive out there, and I was looking to change things up. Pretty little city here. Well, I guess it's not that little. Sure rains a lot. I guess there's worse things though, eh?" John looked at my reflection in the mirror, and I could tell he was glaring at me from beneath his dark sunglasses. "My wife's got a headache. No offense, but we'll just enjoy the scenery and some peace and quiet, okay?" I silently called BS on Lynne having a headache, but went along with it, apologizing and telling Lynne I hoped she felt better soon. About halfway to the flats, we heard sirens off in the distance. I wasn't sure if they were in front of us or behind us, but they seemed to be getting closer, and I felt John's knees smack the seat again as he shifted in his position. He seemed to take notice this time that when he banged the back of my seat, I felt it, and it jarred me forward a touch. "Hey, any chance you could pull your seat up a bit? It's kind of cramped back here. I've got long legs. You'd think if you were going to drive people around, that you'd be at least considerate of the space they need to be comfortable back here." I thought this might be a chance to steal a glance at Lynne, so I said, "Sorry, sir, I have long legs too, and this is about as far as I can move the seat up. Tell you what, I'll just pull over at the car dealership up ahead, and you can switch spots with your wife. There will be more room on that side." As I said that, I put my blinker on and started to decelerate. "It's fine," snapped John, and purposely kicked the back of my seat as he repositioned himself yet again. What a child, I thought, but I knew enough not to get sucked into a power struggle and just ignored it as I continued to drive. The sirens faded away from us, and I wasn't sure if it was police, fire, or ambulance. I have a fairly active imagination, but I was pretty sure that John felt uncomfortable when he heard them. "Probably the boys in blue," I said. "There's a bad intersection back there on 22nd Street. Usually a few minor fender benders there every year." I watched John and Lynne closely to see how they reacted to me mentioning the police. I thought I saw Lynne start to look up and then bow her head back down again. John didn't seem fazed. "Maybe," he said, and then he went back to looking out the rear passenger window. We were now only minutes away from their destination, and I desperately wanted to buy a little more time, just to at least be able to make contact with Lynne and make sure she was okay before I dropped them off. They didn't answer when I asked if they were from here, so I thought I would take a bit of a detour and see if they'd notice. At the next stoplight we stopped at, I waited until it turned green and then put my blinker on, making a right instead of going straight. Immediately John leaned forward, his head between Lynne and I, and said, "Why did you turn?" "Come again," I said, playing dumb, to which he replied angrily. "I said, why did you turn? I thought you said you knew your way around. We should have went straight at that last light." "Hey, take it easy. I was down that way yesterday, and they had part of the road ripped up. It was pretty bumpy, and cars were driving pretty slow. I'm just going to go around it. It shouldn't be any longer to go this way." After I said this, I waited to see if John would call my bluff, but he didn't say anything. He pulled out his phone, glanced down at it, and then jammed it back into his pocket before leaning back, all the while keeping his right arm firmly wrapped around Lynne's petite frame. The way he squeezed her and spoke for her instead of letting her talk made me really angry, and I thought he must be a control freak. What I worried about was what were the lengths to which he exerted that control. My brain screamed that there were enough major red flags that I needed to try something to try and find out. That's when I said, "Hey, you know what, John? I think that I actually can pull my seat up a bit. If you don't mind, Just give it a little push when I pull the lever. It's tricky to slide while we're moving. Don't worry about it, said John as I pulled the lever and jammed my seat back into his legs. You moron, he said as he reached forward and shoved my seat. In the brief moment that John took his attention off of Lynne, she quickly and subtly made a hand gesture that I recognized as a plea for help. I belong to a program here that matches at-risk children with someone that can serve as a bit of a mentor and a positive influence, kind of like a big sister like I wish I had when I was young. The little girl that I've been paired with showed me a video a few months ago about that very hand gesture that was making its way around social media. My heart raced as I processed the signal. My instincts kicked in, and I knew I had to do something. But how could I help Lynne without alerting John? As my seat locked back in position, John reached back for Lynne and pulled her close again. Are you okay? I asked John. Sorry about that. I could tell John was furious, but he showed surprising restraint and just snapped back. Fine, just drive. Now that I knew Lynne was in trouble, I wanted to be careful not to push John too far towards anger. The last thing I wanted was for him to take it out on her. We only had a few kilometers left to go, and I started to panic. Another siren sounded in the distance, and through the fog I saw the flashing blue and red lights approaching. I pulled over to the side of the road and waited for the lights to pass. As it got closer, I noticed it was a cop car. In a desperate act, I flashed my lights, trying to get their attention. It was stupid, but like I said, I was desperate. The cop car didn't slow down and proceeded to speed past us, heading in the opposite direction. That's when John grabbed my seatbelt and pulled it tight around my neck. What do you think you're doing? He screamed at me. You flashed your lights. Do you know what I could do to you? I shook my head no and started to respond to try to talk him down, but he let go of Lynne and punched me hard in the side of my head, right in my temple. I saw stars for a brief moment. Things escalated so fast. I regretted being so brazen and naive about the threat that he actually posed to me and to Lynne. I could hear her sobbing softly now. As I reached up to try to prevent the seatbelt from cutting off my windpipe, I managed to squeeze a few fingers between the seatbelt and my skin and pulled hard towards the steering wheel. John was much stronger than he looked. Although he only had one hand on my belt, I couldn't budge it. He punched me twice more, and I let go of the seatbelt with my right hand so I could use it to block the next punch that was surely to follow. I managed to cry out to Lynne to run, and she courageously leapt towards the rear passenger door and flung it open. But John reached out and grabbed her by the hair, yanking her back inside the car. While John struggled with Lynne, I was able to lay on the horn with my one free hand. Cars whizzed by, but no one stopped. Maybe they couldn't see the horror that was taking place inside my car. John started spewing all kinds of hate at Lynne and at me. His words were cutting, and he went into graphic, gory, and demented detail about what he was going to do to both of us. Lynne's sobs became louder and uncontrollable now as she said she was sorry. John was spitting and ranting. It was like he was possessed, like he was the embodiment of pure evil. I've never in my whole life witnessed something as utterly terrifying. What he said he was going to do with us was way beyond the depths of depravity I could have ever imagined. He seemed to be getting some sort of pleasure the more that he made Lynne cry and the more he made me struggle to stay conscious. In the middle of this tirade, he started laughing, a deep, guttural, homicidal laugh as he turned to Lynne and yelled, "This is all your fault, Danielle. I told you not to ever open the door. You never learn. I have to keep teaching and teaching and teaching. One day, you will learn to do what you are told and that I make the rules." He told me that I get to make the rules and you need to listen. My mind was spinning and so was my world. As my vision started to blur, it looked as though the fog had seeped into the car and was threatening to swallow me into some deep dark void. With every ounce of will and determination I had within me, in one fluent motion, I reached between my leg with my free arm, pulled the seat adjustment lever, and kicked as hard as I could against the floorboard beside my brake pedal, smashing the seat back as far as it would go into John's legs. I then reached back and grabbed John's hair and ear, knocking off his sunglasses as I jammed my thumb into his right eye. John let out a scream and sounded like a wounded animal as he released the seatbelt and tried to pry my thumb out of his eye socket. With my left hand, I reached across my body, I undid my seatbelt, and tried to turn myself so that I could stay on the offensive. But John punched me again, hard, and my head snapped back against the windshield. I could taste blood as I saw stars again. I pulled both arms in front of my face and ducked down, making it harder for John to be able to punch me again. I knew that I wasn't going to win in a physical fight, even if my old platoon sergeant had once said I had the heart of a lion. I heard Lynne, or Danielle, whatever the woman's real name was, let out a blood-curdling scream that was quickly muffled as she gasped for air. John was now choking her, and she thrashed wildly, kicking the door and slapping at his arms. I reacted by rolling myself over and putting the car into drive and stomping on the gas pedal, cranking the wheel left and right as we accelerated, trying to make it difficult for John to keep a good grip on Lynne's neck. As the car sped up to around 80 kilometers an hour, I spun the wheel to the left. The car hydroplaned on the wet pavement, and we spun around 360 degrees. This caused John to smash up against his door and let out another guttural scream. I, too, found myself plastered against the side of the car and wished I still had my seatbelt on. Miraculously, we stayed on the highway, and cars in both directions managed to swerve around and avoid us. As the car caught a piece of dry pavement and lurched forward again, I reached up and ripped my seatbelt across my body, clicking it in as I cranked the wheel again and put the car into another fishtail. This time, though, we clipped an oncoming car and careened off it into the ditch and wrapped the driver's side of the car around a hydro pole. I remember hearing the sound of glass breaking and the smell of burning plastic as the airbags deployed with an incredible force. Dazed, I tried to reach the door handle to open my door and get out before John could strike again. I yelled to Lynne again to run, and tried to look into the back seat to see if she could get out or not, but the car was filled with a chalky, powdery, smoky substance, and I couldn't see anything. My ears were ringing and I couldn't hear anything behind me. My fingers found the door handle and I pulled at it, but my door wouldn't open. I managed to undo my belt, crawl across the center console, and escape through the front passenger door, falling out of the car onto the wet grass. It was a struggle, but I managed to get to my feet just as a thick cloud of gray-black smoke started to billow out from under the smashed hood of my car. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw small flames starting to lick at the smoke as it came teeming out. I looked through the blown-out back window and saw Lynne still squirming as she lay on the seat beside John, her feet kicking at the air where the window used to be. John still had her clenched in his fist. I yanked open the door. I could feel the heat as I registered the flames climbing higher. I dove in on top of Lynne and started thrashing at John's hand, trying to get him to let go. As I clawed at his flesh, I looked up at him, expecting his other fist to be flying towards my face at any moment. However, I saw that he was slumped over, dead or unconscious. Blood was pouring out of somewhere on his face as his head lay rested against the back of the front seat. It seemed to take hours, but after what was only a few more seconds, Lynne and I were able to free her, although she lost a lot of hair in the process. As we limped away from the carnage, a car pulled over to help and something exploded behind us as a big ball of flames burst out from under the hood. Other cars pulled over as people came towards us offering blankets and water and dialing 911. Over the sound of the flames and the murmurs of the crowd, From somewhere inside my car came a horrible high-pitched shriek. It sounded inhuman, and the agony that it expressed was unfathomable. "Oh my God," someone said. "There's someone still in there." Lynne reached over to me as we sat propped up against a Good Samaritan's back bumper and held my hand as she whispered, "Thank you." We didn't say another word to each other or to any of the crowd and just watched the flames while we waited for first responders to arrive. Lynne and I were taken to hospital and treated for minor cuts and bruises. It was determined that I had suffered a mild concussion and had a few chipped teeth as well, but other than that, we were all right. Lynne told police her story, and it turns out that her real name is Rachel, not Lynne and not Danielle. Rachel had been abducted by John and kept in the basement of a house close to where I picked them up that night. She didn't know how long she had been there, but based on reports of the last time anyone saw her before she disappeared, it was determined that she had been there for close to 15 weeks. I won't go into the twisted details about what she suffered at John's hands. This isn't a story about suffering. This is a story about surviving. The night I picked her and John up, Rachel had tried to escape her captivity and got as far as the neighbor's house when John caught her. He had been working on replacing his truck's battery when this all occurred, so he didn't have access to a vehicle. Their neighbor had hollered across the yard at John that they were calling the police, so John called for a lift and got out of there before police arrived. Rachel said that John was mysterious and talked like there was someone else in the house, but Rachel never saw anyone other than John. She said from time to time, John would say things like, "He said I can make the rules," and she figured there must be someone else there. Police found the remains of 3 other women buried beneath a shed at the back of the property. They were able to identify all 3, but none of them were named Danielle, leading to speculation that there may be more victims. After firefighters put out the blaze, there wasn't much left of my car. It took an extra long time due to the fire's proximity to hydro lines to extinguish the flames. Within the ashes and debris, they were unable to find any human remains. John's identity is still a mystery. I received an award from the mayor for the part I played in freeing Rachel. I shared it with my little sister, and Rachel asked to meet her so that she could thank her in person for showing me the video that helped to save her life. A campaign was started to raise funds to purchase me a new car, which I now use to shuttle people around as I continue driving for the company and continue playing a little game with myself where I try to guess details about people and their backstories, and then try to see what I can find out and prove whether I'm close or whether I am dead wrong. And for the most part, I'm usually right. Hello, my name is Trey, and I need to clear my conscience and warn people about the dangers of picking up random strangers in your car through rideshare programs. Now, 99% of people are at least halfway decent, but there are some really terrible people out there that are truly sick and twisted individuals. My meager hope is that by telling my story, I can help bring closure to the families and friends impacted, as well as to prevent this from happening to others. This all took place a few years ago, back when I was still married. My wife and I have since divorced. It was an amicable separation, no mudslinging or vendettas. My ex and I had just sort of grown apart, and although we care about each other, it has become more of a platonic relationship than a romantic one. Our 2 girls are grown up now and have moved out, and rather than keep being roommates, we decided to end our marriage. To be honest, I don't think I was intellectually matched to her anyways. She is brilliant. She was the breadwinner in our household. I contributed my fair share, but it just took me more hours and juggling a career and a couple of side hustles to be able to be close to an equal partner. One of those side hustles was driving for a rideshare company at night. At the time I signed on back in 2014, it was a newer app and it had recently expanded into our neck of the woods and was looking for drivers. I love driving and I jumped at the chance to get paid to do it. It was especially in demand late at night and it worked well for us. My ex was home, the kids were usually finishing up their homework and then getting ready for bed when I would be heading out. I tried to start by 10 p.m. at the latest and then push through until 3 a.m. to still leave a few hours for me to get some shut-eye before starting my 9 to 5. By no means was driving a get-rich scheme. The price of fuel and all, it really didn't pay for much, but when you have a family, every little bit counts. I had a few regulars that I'd shuttle to and from the pub or from bars downtown, and we had a fair amount of tourists come through town in the summer. That usually meant there were ample ride requests to make the night go by at a steady pace. And you know, as I said earlier, the vast majority of folks were good eggs, but there were a couple punks that I wanted to tune in sometimes. But of course, I didn't. I'm what my girls call a pacifist, and I try my darndest to use my words to de-escalate things when they get heated. I guess you could say that I have a gift for the gab, which in truth was a bit of an asset when driving people around. The rides went by much quicker if I could chat up my customers as we zipped around town. That summer, I picked up a man one night from the bar and struck up a conversation with him. He was definitely intoxicated, but looked like something was weighing heavily on him. I tried to lighten things up by cracking a few jokes and poking fun at myself and some people who were prominent in the news at that time. After a few minutes, his demeanor changed and he was a pleasant fella to talk to. I figured that he was in his mid to late 40s. He had thinning sandy blonde hair and looked like, when he was maybe a bit younger and in his prime, that he was a pretty muscular dude. He was big and stocky now, but I wouldn't say that he was overly buff, just solid, kind of like an old oak tree. While he was pleasant to talk to, he did speak with a rather gruff, firm tone, and his eyes were a little wild. He made good eye contact when we were chatting, but I could tell that he wasn't the kind of person that you wanted to cross. The first time I gave him a ride, everything went smoothly. I dropped him off at a little cabin just outside of town, near the hiking and biking trails. He said he'd rented the place for the season and thanked me for the ride. The next night I picked him up again. It was about the same time of night, shortly after the last call, and I drove him out to the cabin. Our ride was much the same that second night. He climbed in the back, looking downtrodden, but after a bit of prompting, he was engaging and we shared some laughs on our way through town. He said he appreciated that I had picked him up both nights, and he asked when I was working next. I told him that I tried to get a few hours every night except for Wednesday. Back at that time, on Wednesdays, we tried as much as possible to spend time with the kids and play a game or watch something together on TV. He introduced himself as Carl, and I told him my name was Trey. He said that he hoped we'd run into each other again, as he was here for the summer, and before getting out, he reached up and patted me on the shoulder and said goodnight. When he did so, it surprised me just how fast his hand moved and how forceful the friendly gesture was. It knocked me forward a few inches away from the seat, but I figured it was just because he was drunk and probably didn't realize just how strong he was. The next morning, I drove the girls to school and my youngest found something in the back seat which she passed up to me as we drove. It was a folded up sketch of a woman. It was fairly basic, more of an outline of her body and no real distinct facial features. Kind of looked like someone who was taking an art class practicing their compositions. On the back of the sketch was a list of 7 or 8 dates and times. I turned the paper over, examining it, while stopped at a red light a few blocks from the girls' school, and didn't really think much of it. It didn't look like anything important enough to keep in case any of my customers misplaced it and tried to track it down. I crumpled it up and put it in a little collapsible garbage can I kept in the car to prevent people from leaving wrappers or other trash jammed in my cup holders. When the girls hopped out at their school, my youngest found a second item that someone had left behind in the bag. I guess the sketch had caught her interest, so she was rummaging around looking for other interesting items, and she found a small jackknife wedged between where the seat meets the seat back. Dad, she said, as she held out the knife. This is pretty dangerous to be back here. I had forgotten that the girls did worry about me driving strangers around at night. I figured they watched too much TV, but in retrospect, they had reason to be wary. When I looked at the knife, I immediately thought that it must be Carl's. He struck me as someone who would want to be prepared for occasions when having a blade would prove to be handy. My father-in-law, without fail, is always the first to pull out his Swiss Army knife to cut tape off Christmas presents, and never leaves home without it. I told the girls that this wasn't the kind of knife that people use for nefarious purposes. This is more of a utility tool for anglers, hunters, campers, and the like. Outdoorsy folks who need to cut rope or open supplies. I shooed the girls off to school, and meeting my youngest serious look of concern in my mirror, I turned around, looked her in the eyes, and told her not to worry. I had been driving for a number of years now, and that I was always safe and alert. She reluctantly accepted my reassurance and closed the door and walked to meet a group of friends just outside of the school drop-off zone. I considered taking a drive up to the cabin on my lunch break to see if this was Carl's knife, but then I thought better of it. I figured that would be pretty intrusive on my part, especially if it turned out not to be his knife. Turning the knife over and over in my right hand as I drove, my fingers traced along something engraved in the casing. I glanced down and saw that the initials DS were etched into the black, hard plastic outer shell. That ruled out the knife being Carl's, or so I thought at the time, so I just tossed it into the glove box on the chance someone did come looking for it, thinking maybe it was a keepsake or a gift if it had someone's initials engraved on it. All day at work I kept thinking about the knife and for some reason picturing Carl turning that little cabin upside down looking for it. The idea started to creep back into my head that I could take a zip out to the cabin and ask Carl if it was his. But then I realized that I couldn't make it there and back on my half-hour lunch. By mid-afternoon, I had resolved that I needed to make a run out of town before heading home for supper. I'm not sure when, but at some point during the afternoon, I had thought of 2 reasons why the initials on the knife didn't contain the letter C or K. I wasn't actually sure which way Carl spelled his name. 1, Carl could have been his middle name, and his initials were actually DS. Or 2, the knife belonged to someone important to Carl that passed it down to him, like his father or grandfather, and their initials were DS. At 5 p.m., I drove out to the cabin to see if Carl was missing the little knife. I got to the cabin at about 20 past 5 and hesitated before going to knock on the door. I worried that I might come off as a bit of a creep, but I wanted to get the thoughts out of my head that Carl was potentially in a tizzy looking for this knife because of its sentimental value. I knocked on the door and waited for a minute, but no one answered. I knocked again and waited another minute. No one answered. There wasn't a doorbell on the cabin, so I knocked a 3rd time and tried to shelve my disappointment as I latched on to a fleeting hope that Carl would answer the door, but still no one answered. I turned and started walking back to the car, feeling like a kid who found out that the fair was canceled. As I reached down to open my door, I heard Carl's booming voice come from the woods behind the cabin. "Trey, can I help you? What are you doing up here?" I was surprised at the tone of his voice. It was aggressive and almost accusatory. It made me flinch as I wasn't expecting it, and then I felt a lump in my throat as I turned around, trying to look casual. "I'm sorry to bother you, man, but I found this in my back seat, and I thought it might be yours. I apologize for barging in on you like that. It's just that I was worried that it was maybe important to you." Carl walked with a purposeful stride as he approached me. I was surprised at how quickly he was able to close the gap from where he had first called out beyond the cabin. I was a bit intimidated by his size as we stood there under the partial shade of the pines that the cabin was nestled under. I had to look up at him to look him in the eye. I'm about 5'10", and he was easily 5 or 6 inches taller than me. I couldn't believe how broad his shoulders were and how thick his neck was. I had originally pegged him as a cop or ex-military, but now I wondered if he was some type of athlete, like a rugby player or amateur weightlifter. His eyes seemed even more wild now, and he just stood there studying me with a deadpan look on his face. I couldn't tell if he was angry or just defensive because I had surprised him. I don't think I said anything at that point, as I can still recall how scared I was of him. He truly seemed to emit an overwhelmingly menacing energy. I took a half a step back and then held out the knife in my open left hand, my right hand ready to pull the car door open and dive inside to lock the door if needed. "How did you know that was mine?" Carl demanded as he continued to stare me down. He didn't even look at the knife. His eyes stayed trained on me like a predator stalking their prey. I didn't. I just thought that it might be yours, and I thought that I would see if you needed it back." "Huh," Carl grunted. He reached down and grabbed the knife and slipped it into his pocket, his eyes still locked on mine. I could feel sweat dripping from under the brim of my ball cap, and I nervously took it off and wiped it away with the back of my hand. "Did you track down all of your other riders and show them the knife, or did you only come looking for me?" "Listen, man, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. I'll hit the road and leave you to it," I stuttered as I flopped my hat back on the crown of my head, with the peak a little more vertical to let the air flow a bit better. I turned to open the door, and as I did, I immediately regretted it. It was like I had turned my back on a bear or some other threatening wild animal. Carl smacked me on the back, and I lurched forward, bumping against my driver's side door, which prevented me from opening it. As I peeled myself off of the door, embarrassed at how weak I must have looked, I braced myself for the worst and turned around to face Carl again and continue his interrogation of me. As I pivoted, Carl said, "Thanks, friend. It is my knife, and I was hoping that I'd find it." His words were appreciative, but his tone was almost one of annoyance, as if it was somehow my fault that he had left his knife in my car. "No worries," I replied, and then I caught myself before I blurted out, "What are you up to back there?" The last thing I needed to do was put him back on the defensive. Something wasn't quite right about him, and I just wanted to get out of there, but Carl seemed to sense that I was biting my tongue. He sized me up again and then squinted a bit and said, "You working tonight, Trey?" My mind was reeling as I tried to figure out how to talk myself away from this big brute and make a beeline back home. "No, it's Wednesday. It's our family night." Carl replied. "Well, you wouldn't want your lovely wife and pretty little daughters to have to wait for your sorry ass." Carl smiled a forced, toothless grin with pursed lips as he hissed. I felt a series of tiny tremors shiver down each arm as my body tensed up, and I felt my face scrunch in disgust and anger. If I was a stronger man, I would have said, "Don't you talk about my wife and daughters, you son of a..." But I took a deep breath and tried to fake a zen-like stoicism, but in reality, I was almost in tears and barely holding myself together. I simply said, "Have a good night," and turned and climbed into my car. Home free, I thought. But as I turned on the ignition, Carl knocked forcefully on the window and bent down to peer in at me. I wanted to just floor it and get the hell out of there. but my body overrode my brain and with a muscle memory type response, rolled down the window instead. Trey, you know I'm just messing with you, right? Carl's face had morphed back into the face of the guy I drove home the last 2 nights. Wild eyes, yes, but engaging and not aggressive. I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. Was I overreacting just because of his physical imposing stature? Was this something he has to put up with a lot because he's such a big tree trunk of a man? Or was I right to think that he was trouble and I needed to steer clear? Phew, I said. I almost crapped my pants. You got me good. I feigned a smile and again wished him a good night. You too, Trey. Oh, hey, you didn't happen to find anything else of mine, did you? I froze after he asked. My head throbbed and I felt my eyes welling up with tears again out of fear and anxiety. I honestly had no idea whether to admit that I had in my possession a sketch that may or may not be his. Hey, he hollered at my stunned face. Did you find anything else of mine? Oh, sorry. No, that's all I found in the back. Geez, man, maybe you should skip games night and get some sleep. You're jumpy. Listen, thanks for returning my knife. I'll see you again. With that, I just nodded, and as he stood back up straight, pulling back from my open window, I put the car in drive and headed towards home. The whole drive, I replayed the strange, tense, and somewhat terrifying interaction that had just occurred between Carl and I. Was he a monster, or just really socially inept? Maybe he took roids, or still does, and that affected his brain, because the way that he switches between demeanors is unnatural. I criticized myself for all of the dumb moves and stupid things I said, as I tried to interpret just exactly what had happened. While stopped at a red light 3 stoplights away from my house, I took a few deep breaths and tried to shake off the whole thing. As I looked around, trying to find something else to focus on, my gaze fell upon the little garbage container, and with a sigh, I flipped open the lid and retrieved the sketch. What mystery did this paper hold? Was it Carl's? Was it related to the knife? Did he draw that sketch? He didn't look like an arts and crafts kind of guy. You never know. Maybe he turns to art to calm the raging beast inside him, so he doesn't act like a frigging tool like he had just done with me. The light turned green and I turned right and used hands-free to call home. I told my wife that something came up at work and that I was going to have to miss games night. She could tell that something was wrong. Not because game night was sacred or anything. We have missed multiple for this reason or that. She knew the tone of my voice, and she knew when I was upset. She asked if I was all right, and I said yes, I was fine. She said, no, you're not. Be careful, and when you're ready to talk about whatever is bothering you, I will be here. I drove around for the next few hours as I tried to figure out what was going on with Carl and what I should do. At that time, I didn't really have anything other than a gut feeling to go on. Sure, Carl was an a-hole when I took him back his knife, but there are a-holes out there. He wouldn't be the first or the last one that I would encounter. As the sun set shortly after 9, I realized that I had been driving aimlessly for the better part of 3 hours, and I hadn't eaten, and I was stiff from sitting for so long. The adrenaline that had surged through me earlier had depleted a good chunk of my energy, and I felt exhausted, like I had just run a marathon and lost. I wheeled into a gas station a few blocks from the bar where I had picked Carl up the 2 previous nights. As I climbed out of the car to stretch, I realized that I had been more or less circling the bar for the last few hours. Was I subconsciously thinking that I would maybe catch a glimpse of Carl? Then I felt a chill run down my back and I shuddered. Was Carl going to do something to someone with that knife? Did I unknowingly just return an implement that he intended to use to harm someone? Was he going to do something to the woman in the sketch? I reached into my car and pulled out the piece of paper. I still didn't know if it even belonged to Carl. But what if it did? I filled my car up with fuel and desperately tried to figure out what I should do. I was truly at a loss. Even though I knew it wasn't going to do any good, I decided to call the police and tell them about Carl and ask if there is anything they could do in a situation like this. Maybe they could go out to the cabin and question him, or maybe they could monitor the bar and keep an eye out for him. The dispatcher I spoke to was kind, and he connected me with an on-duty constable who listened to my story and confirmed what I had suspected. There wasn't a lot that they could do. She provided me with her extension and badge number and said if I had anything else to report, to give her a call. I sat in my car watching people come and go from the bar until it closed and there was no sign of Carl. Relieved, I headed for home to try and get some much-needed rest. In the morning, I would decide what to do next. As tired as I was, I couldn't get much sleep. Carl dominated my thoughts, and I couldn't slow my brain down enough to get any type of quality sleep. The next morning, I dropped the girls at school and headed to work. By about 2:30, I was feeling pretty zombie-ish and was running on fumes. I took my 15-minute break and decided to call my wife and tell her about Carl. I went out to my car for some privacy and dialed her cell. She listened while I spewed all of the weird interactions that I'd had with Carl over the last few days and told her about the knife and about the folded up sketch with the dates and times on the back. Then I shared all of the gruesome things that I had imagined Carl doing with that knife to the woman in the sketch. When it was finally her turn to speak, she calmly asked if I wanted her opinion, and I said yes. I was at a real loss and feeling like if I didn't do something and Carl hurt someone, that I wouldn't be able to live with the guilt. I don't remember her exact words, but she made me understand that it took some really impressive mental gymnastics on my part to leap to the conclusions that I had about Carl and his sinister intentions. She asked me what I would think if the knife and paper belonged to one of my other passengers. What if they belonged to a woman, or an elderly, frail, kind old man? These questions helped me to see that I may have been basing my assumptions off of Carl's physical appearance and imposing stature. When I said how menacing he had acted when I returned the knife to him, my wife reminded me that previous to that, my interactions with Carl had been cordial and that it sounded like I had thought he was a good guy. She said that I had been stretching myself a little too thin and that she had been meaning to talk to me about it. She suggested that perhaps when our daughter presented the paper and the knife to me, that I had reacted to her irrational fear instead of taking a step back and putting the finding of the two items into proper perspective. I reluctantly agreed as my break neared its conclusion and thanked her as I walked back to finish my shift. I felt the tension that had gripped me for the last 24 hours finally start to subside, and I was glad that she had talked me down. After work, we had supper with the girls, and any thoughts of Carl had left my mind. Around 9-ish, I headed out for a few hours of driving. As I started the car, I did think about Carl again and wondered what the chances were that I'd pick him up again. Just to be on the safe side, I decided that I just wouldn't accept any ride requests from the area around the bar. If Carl was even there tonight, he could find someone else to drive him. My first few passengers were pretty tame, tourists asking the usual about where young people like to go for fun around town. It was when I picked up my third passenger that the fear and anxiety that only hours ago I had finally been able to push away came surging back over me. I picked up a young woman wearing scrubs and who looked to be in her early 20s outside of a nursing home on the west side of town. Shortly after she put her seatbelt on, she said, "Hey, thanks a lot for picking me up. I wasn't sure that anyone would be accepting rides after what happened last night." "Oh," I said, "I hadn't heard about anything. What happened?" "It was all over the 6 o'clock news," the woman said. I looked up in the mirror to make eye contact and noted that her eyes were wide and her face was scrunched up in disgust. Apparently some psychopath snapped and stabbed 2 people last night. If you turn on your radio, I'm sure you'll catch the full story. But what I heard was that this guy left with a girl from a bar downtown and they took a rideshare back to her place. But when they got there, he stabbed the girl he was with and stabbed the driver too. I figured you guys would have some type of code red or something to alert you if that sort of thing happened so that you could, be aware just in case or something. I hesitated briefly and then asked what bar the driver picked up the guy and the girl from. And to my horror, it was the same bar that I had picked Carl up from on Monday and Tuesday evening. Did they catch the guy? I asked as all color drained from my face and my fingers tingled and went numb. Not the last I heard. That's why it's been on the news. Police are asking if anyone saw anything last night that might help them figure out who he was. That's why I called for a ride tonight. I usually walk. It's a nice way to have some downtime to myself after my 12-hour shift. But there's no way I'm walking out there alone tonight with a murderer on the loose. I felt a panic attack coming on, or at least what I thought a panic attack must feel like. I've never had one before, but my breathing changed and I felt winded. I started sweating and felt a pain in my chest. I held it together long enough to drop the woman off at her apartment, and then I called 911 and told them they needed to go to the cabin. The dispatcher took the information I provided about Carl's description and said that an officer would be in touch. After I hung up, I fell apart and started crying and yelling, smashing my fists down on my steering wheel. I turned on the local radio station and waited to hear if there was any more coverage of the case. As the easy rock played on in the background, I became restless, and so I put the car in drive and headed out towards the cabin where Carl was staying. About 10 miles south of the cabin, 3 police cruisers overtook me, and I felt a small sense of hope that they were going to get to the cabin, find Carl there, and take him into custody before he could get away and before he could hurt anyone else. After they passed by me, the guilt overcame me and I had to pull over as I broke down for the second time. Was this my fault? Could I have stopped Carl? Tell me he didn't use the knife that I had returned to him. I pleaded with the nothingness in my car. I looked up at the rearview mirror and could picture Carl sitting behind me, his face contorted between all of the faces he had shown me in our few interactions. Lost, withdrawn Carl, laughing, engaging Carl, angry alpha Carl, and always those wild eyes. A few more cruisers flew past where I was parked alongside of the road. I figured there was nothing for me to do at the cabin, and that this was in the hands of the police now. There wasn't anything I could do up there. I felt utterly hopeless and like I desperately needed to do something. The only thing I could think to do was head to the police station and offer to provide more information if they needed it. Anything that I could think of to help. Maybe they could swab my car for fingerprints. The police interviewed me and took all of the information I provided to them about Carl. But as I told them everything I knew, I realized I didn't really know much about him. They told me to go home and that they'd let me know if they needed to talk to me again. I arrived back home shortly after 1 a.m. and turned on the TV. There was news coverage of police searching the cabin. The reporters shared that the police were on the lookout for a person of interest and gave Carl's description in relation to the murder of 2 people who were stabbed Wednesday night. My wife found me sitting in front of the TV when she got up around 6 a.m. We talked briefly and she told me that I didn't need to feel guilty, that there was nothing I did wrong, and nothing that I could have done to prevent this from happening. No way of really predicting that Carl was a killer. That morning was the last time we ever spoke about Carl, and over the next few years, we kind of grew apart. Carl murdered those 2 people on October 17th, 2019. Police believe he may be linked to 2 other similar murders that took place in the 5 years prior. Both murders involved the murder of a woman and a rideshare driver. They believe that Carl's real name is Donald Sinclair. Police told me that I am lucky. They don't have to say it. Trust me, I know that it could have been me. To be honest, sometimes I wish it was. Why was I spared? These and many other thoughts haunt my days and nights. I had to quit providing rides because I was constantly afraid that I would run into Carl again. And although the police said they can't tell what kind of knife was used, I'm sure it was the knife that I gave back to Carl. In telling my story, I'm not looking for sympathy. I tell you all this because, like I constantly remind my daughters, there are times when you can feel things, when you have to listen to your gut or respond to your spidey senses if they're tingling. And also, to be careful out there. 99% of people are halfway decent, but there are people, like Carl, who are just plain evil. My name is Tim, and my story is something I haven't been able to speak publicly about since it took place a few years ago. I had been a rideshare driver for just over 3 years, and during that time I'd seen my fair share of strange things. Drunk, belligerent passengers, heated domestic arguments, and people too high on drugs to remember where they lived. Although some customers could be jerks, and some were really sketchy, for the most part, giving people a ride from point A to point B wasn't a bad way to make some cash. But there was this one night that something messed up happened that made me quit being a driver. It was shortly after midnight on an overcast rainy night in October when I accepted the ride request. The pin on the map led me to an older part of town. That area had been somewhat left behind as new businesses and new housing was going up on the other side of town. I pulled up to the address that the request came from and parked on the street outside a fourplex that looked abandoned. All of the lights were off in the building, but there were garbage cans and some cardboard boxes outside of one of the units on the west side of the building, and the exterior light by that unit's door was on. The rain was coming down pretty good, so it was a bit hard to see clearly. I didn't see any signs of my rider, or any movement from any of the units, but then someone appeared beside my driver's side door, and I rolled down the window to ask them if they needed a lift. The person didn't say anything but moved to the back door and opened it and climbed inside. From what I could see of her in my rearview mirror, she looked kind of disheveled. She was soaked, and her dark coat was ripped and seemed to be a few sizes too big and bulky for her as it drooped off of her shoulders. It was hard to tell if the coat was dark blue or black. She had her hood up, and her long tangled hair was partially covering her face as she sat with her head bowed, looking down at her lap. "Hi there," I said. "It's a wet one out there." The woman didn't say anything in response. It wasn't that unusual for riders not to want to make small talk, so I put the car in drive and started off to her destination, trying to respect her privacy. I hesitated looking in the rearview mirror to get a better look at her, but I thought I could see her shaking, and her breathing seemed like she was shuddering a bit from being cold and wet, so I turned up the heat to try to give her some comfort. We didn't have super far to go. The destination she had requested was only about a 20-minute drive. I figured it was going to be a quiet ride, but maybe like a minute down the road, after I turned up the heat, I got a whiff of a strong odor that was really gross. I have a fairly strong stomach, but this smell was really rank. It took me a bit to try to figure out what it was. It wasn't like a BO smell or a smoky, dirty smell, and it didn't smell like cat feces. When I realized what the smell actually reminded me of is when I first started to get creeped out. Growing up, we used to have a problem with mice getting in our house. Sometimes at night, my brother and I would hear them scratching around in the walls, and it kind of grossed us out. The odd time one of them would die in the walls or in the wood room where we couldn't see them, but the smell was obvious that something had died and was decaying. It usually lasted a couple weeks, and then it would get better. I was pretty sure that the smell coming from my back seat was the same smell, and I cringed, thinking about the dead mice in the walls and wondering why she smelled so bad. Maybe she had mice problems too, and the smell had gotten into her clothes and then the rain made it worse. I reached over and cut the heat back a bit to try to avoid spreading the smell. I felt kind of bad because it did seem like she was cold, but I didn't think I could stomach it the whole way with the heat amplifying and circulating the stench. I considered cracking the window, but thought that would be rude as the rain might splash back onto her as she sat behind me. So I just tried breathing out of my mouth instead of my nose. That helped a bit, but it was still pretty bad. When I turned the heat down, that reduced the noise from the fan, and that's when I started to hear the woman whispering to herself. Originally I thought that it was her shivering, but now I realized that she was muttering to herself. Again, nothing that I haven't experienced before. I kind of felt bad for her as she was probably suffering from some sort of mental health issue, and with smelling like that, I couldn't imagine what sort of living condition she was in. We were about halfway to where she wanted to go when I couldn't resist trying to get a better look at the woman. It was out of pity, not fear, that I wanted to see her. I glanced up at the mirror, pretending to check for anything behind us as we drove, and saw that she was still looking down at her lap. Through the darkness, and through the hair that hung down in front of her face, I could faintly see that her lips were moving, and she was still whispering to herself. Seeing her lips, I tried to listen closer to see if I could hear what she was actually saying, but I couldn't make out any of the words, though it seemed like she was having a conversation with herself, because she would whisper a few things, and then pause, and then whisper again. As we drove on, I found myself drawn to the mysterious woman, trying to steal a better look at her and trying to hear what she was saying, while still trying not to breathe in too much of the rancid smell. As I peeked up at the mirror, the woman shifted in her seat. It seemed like the first time she had moved at all since getting in. Up until then, she had sat fairly still, apart from her lips moving as she whispered away. I tried to keep my curious staring concealed in subtle glances in the mirror, pretending to be checking for approaching traffic from behind us, even though it was a pretty quiet night traffic-wise on the roads. Then the woman lifted up her arm, and I saw for the first time that she was holding something. It looked like an old-style handbag or large purse. It had some type of patterned material on it, but it looked to be soaking wet too, and it was hard to see what color it actually was in the darkness. As the woman lifted the bag with her right hand, she also raised her face as if following the bag with her gaze. Her whispers weren't as muffled now that she was looking up instead of down at her lap. She hadn't been whispering to herself. She had been whispering to the bag, talking to it as we drove along. I thought that given the size of the bag, it was possible that she had a small dog with her, but I couldn't see any little head poking out of the bag, and although it was dark, I was pretty sure that the bag was fully closed. The motion of lifting the bag wafted a strong whiff of the putrid odor towards me, and I had an involuntary gag reflex, which I tried to disguise by fake coughing over top of it to not offend her. But my choking must have startled her, because her eyes snapped from gazing at the bag to meet mine in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were hollow. A dark black stare is the best way to describe the way she looked at me. I looked away and quickly said excuse me as I cleared my throat, still trying to pretend to fake cough. Being caught staring at her made me feel nervous and awkward. I felt my face get a little hot as I was embarrassed for staring, and also embarrassed for realizing at that moment that I was actually a bit scared of the woman. I was ashamed for judging her and tried to rationalize away any fear that I felt by telling myself she was just someone who was struggling, and that if she was my mom or someone that I cared about, I would want people to be kind to her. Trying to make some type of authentic connection with the woman, I said, "Pretty quiet night tonight. We're making good time. I'll get you to your stop shortly." As I finished speaking, I smiled and glanced up at the mirror, hoping to catch her gaze and show her kindness in my facial expression. Her eyes were still staring at me in the mirror, and seeing my smile, she started to smile back. I let out a bit of a relieved sigh, thinking that any awkward tension was going to go away, and the last few minutes of our ride would be more comfortable. But then the woman lowered her bag back into her lap and cocked her head to one side, leaning forward closer to me while still staring at me in the mirror. She started to fake cough as if strangely mocking me for my lame attempt to hide my gut reaction to her horrible smell. I didn't know how to respond, and I could feel her staring at me, but I didn't want to look back up and make eye contact. I was scared now, scared that I had offended her, and scared that she seemed to be somewhat unpredictable. I had been trying to ignore how disgusted I was, but my brain registered now that I was in fact feeling quite nauseous. As she continued to fake cough in short repetitive sequences, I could almost feel her breath on me. I felt my face tense up as I winced and leaned away from her. She continued coughing as we drove on. Thankfully, we were almost at her stop. I tried to power through the uncomfortable situation as my body and brain reacted to the mysterious woman behind me. Finally, I sensed the woman lean back from me. I figured she was preparing to exit the car as we were almost there. As she leaned back, her fake coughing morphed into laughter, a mix of maniacal laughter with actual coughing, as her laughter seemed to make her choke. As she carried on in the back seat, a car approached. I think it was the only other car we had seen on the road that night, and as it passed us, its headlights illuminated the woman's face that had been partially concealed in shadows and partially hidden behind her hair. I could see that she had food stained around her mouth and down her chin, like a child who had just finished eating spaghetti and had sauce all over them. I was surprised at my reaction to this. Instead of feeling sorry for her, the emotion that this provoked in me was anger. I was disgusted, and my fight or flight response was shifting from flight to fight as I felt my body tense up and my hands grip the wheel tighter. As the approaching car passed by us, the woman seemed to be distracted by it, and her head cranked to the side, following the car with her gaze as it passed by her window. As she did so, some of her wet, ratty hair whipped me in the side of the face, a few strands slapping the corner of my mouth. "Aw, come on," I yelled as I reached up to wipe my face and sputtered, trying to make sure nothing got into my mouth. "Listen, just sit still back there, okay? We're just about there." My voice trembled in a mix of anger and anxiety as I scolded her like a little child who was impatiently fooling around on a long car ride. To my surprise, the woman responded by sitting back in her seat. I cracked my window to get some relief from the noxious odor and to try to break the tension in the car. I made the final turn onto the street that she had requested to be dropped off at, and as I did so, she started to whisper to the bag again. This time, her whispers were more like snarls, and her hood shook as she uttered whatever strange sentences she was saying. I clenched my teeth and huffed, thinking, just get this lady out of my car. I was driving faster than I should have been, and almost passed her stop. I had to slam on the brakes to prevent going past it, which would have meant spending another few seconds with this woman. The road was wet and my car skidded a bit before coming to a stop. I left my foot on the brake and didn't put the car in park. I didn't plan on lingering there any longer than I needed to. I looked up at my rearview mirror, hoping to see her moving towards the door, but she wasn't there. I remember thinking, what the hell is going on now? I turned my head to look directly into the back seat and saw that she was now lying down across it. "Hey," I hollered. She didn't flinch. She had somehow scrambled as far to the passenger side of the car as she could and was now curled up in a ball, lying on her right side, with her feet towards me and her head against the rear passenger door. Her left arm was raised towards her head, but her long scraggly hair hung over her hand and concealed her face. Her right arm, dangled off the seat towards the floor and was still holding on to the handbag. Through my cracked window, I felt a gust of cold air on the back of my neck that made me shiver. I wasn't sure what to expect next. It didn't look like the woman was going to get out voluntarily, and she just laid there, non-responsive. I wondered if this was a game to her, as if she was messing with me and had been the whole time, like when she mocked me by coughing when I was overwhelmed by her stench. I wanted to get out of there so badly, to go home and shower and to shampoo my car and air it out, but the woman wasn't moving. "Lady, come on, get out. You gotta get out. It's late and I gotta get home." No response again. Just another gust of cold air from outside. Still facing the back seat and breathing through my nose to avoid as much of the smell as possible. I could taste a metallic taste. It was bitter, and my body shuddered. I was now shaking. The air was freezing, the smell and the taste revolting, and I was scared, tired, and frustrated. I reached out towards the woman to give her leg a nudge, to see if I could stir a response from her. I hesitated briefly. In truth, I didn't want to touch her, and I also feared what would happen if I did. Would she claim that I put my hands on her? Was this part of her game too? I decided against it and came up with a different tactic. I grabbed my phone and started to dial the police. "Okay, if you're not going to get out, I'm calling the police." Still no response. As foolish as I felt for bothering the police with this, I just wanted to get the ordeal over with, so I carried through on my threat and called the cops. I explained to them my predicament and asked that they come and assist me to remove the woman from my car. They asked if she had assaulted me or threatened me, to which I said no. They said they would send an officer as soon as they could, but that it wouldn't be a priority and it might take a while, and to call them if things escalated to physical harm. Although disappointed, I kind of understood that the police would need to respond to more serious calls for anything involving imminent danger. This was more of a nuisance to me than anything else. As the rain beat down on my car, another thought crossed my mind. The person that this woman was going to visit might be able to come out and help coax her out of my car. I undid my seatbelt and stepped out into the rainy darkness, stepping right into a puddle which soaked right through my shoes and my socks. I huffed again and thought to myself, what else can go wrong tonight? As I approached the house, I noticed that all the lights were off, but the porch light was on, and there was a car in the driveway. I hesitated for a moment before ringing the bell, realizing that it was pretty late at night to be doing so. I looked at my watch. It was 4:10 a.m. This shocked me. I had picked up the woman shortly after midnight and had only driven for about 20 minutes. I gave my wrist a shake and tapped on the watch face as if that would somehow magically fix it and it would now show me the right time. But no, it still read 4:10. I thought that maybe my watch was wrong and reached into my pocket to grab my phone. My pockets were empty though. I had left my phone in the car. I cursed under my breath. Now I was soaked, cold, tired, and exhausted. A feeling of being overwhelmed washed over me. I was torn. Do I knock? Do I wait for the police? Do I need to just suck it up and deal with getting this woman out of my car myself? I decided that the woman wasn't just my problem and someone else needed to get involved, and not seeing any signs of police, I rang the doorbell and waited. After a minute, no one responded, so I rang it again and knocked loudly. Still, no answer. Perfect, I thought to myself. Guess it's up to me to get this sorted and get out of there. I sprinted back to my car and went to open my door when I thought, no, don't just hop in and try talking to the woman again. That didn't work. So I ran around to the rear passenger door and opened it, hoping that the more assertive tactics would force the woman to comply. I flung the door open, and to my surprise, she was gone. The smell wasn't though, and it slapped me in the face hard. I gagged and pulled my shirt up over my nose. I slammed the door and walked around to the driver's side door, opened it, and flopped down on the driver's seat, shaking my head at how ridiculous this whole thing was. I was exhausted and in need of sleep. I started the car to leave, but then remembered about the police and felt guilty having them come all the way out here for nothing. I rooted around the passenger seat and center console, looking for my phone, planning to call them and tell them not to bother, that the situation was resolved now, but I couldn't find it. Again, the pity party started in my mind. Why me? I continued to rummage around for my phone in the front and reached over into the back seat and started feeling around the best I could reach to see if somehow it ended up back there. I still had my shirt pulled up over my nose, but the stink was burning my eyes. As that sensation registered in my mind, it triggered a thought that I probably didn't want to be touching anything that the woman touched. At least not without gloves on. Forget this, I thought. It'll turn up. I'll call the cops when I get home. I put the car into drive and put my signal on to leave when I saw headlights approaching from behind. Putting the car back into park in case it was the police, I rolled down my window thinking I could just talk to them without having to get back out into the rain. I was freezing, but I didn't want to turn the heat up in case it amplified the woman's sting. As the car approached, I heard what sounded like a splash from off in the distance in front of me. It was hard to be sure over the sound of the rain and my windshield wipers, but I was pretty sure that's what I heard. I remember feeling confused at that point. The house the woman had asked me to drop her off at was in the middle of a residential suburb. The splash sounded like it was in deeper water than just a puddle. That's when I looked around and noticed that there were no houses around. I was parked on the side of the road beside a metal guardrail that stood between my car and a large body of water. I reached down for my phone to check the map and the location the woman had originally given me to drop her off at, and was reminded that I didn't know where my phone was. The car pulled up behind me and stopped. No lights or sirens. But I figured it must have been the cops, and of course they didn't need lights and sirens because I hadn't called in an emergency. I heard 2 doors open and 2 sets of footsteps crunching the gravel as they walked up along both sides of my car. And then I heard a voice say, "You all right?" There was a burly officer beside my window now. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a light shining in and around my car from the passenger side. I figured that the second officer was using their flashlight to look and see if the woman was still back there refusing to get out. "Yeah, I'm fine now. Sorry to bother you guys. It's been a long night. She's gone now. I was going to call and let you know, but I misplaced my phone." "Do you have any ID on you?" the officer asked in a flat tone. "I do, but everything's fine now. I was hoping to just be on my way now that she's gone." A rolling crackle of thunder sounded in the distance as I waited for the officer's response. The rain intensified and a storm was now approaching. "I'm gonna need to see that ID," said the officer. "Sure, no worries," I said, and reached behind my back to retrieve my wallet. "Freeze!" came a voice from the other side of the vehicle, and the other officer's flashlight was now trained on me. I froze. The officer beside my window said, "We're going to need you to go ahead and step out of the vehicle." "Okay," I said. "Slowly. Put both of your hands on the steering wheel. We want to ensure everyone's safety here, so listen and follow my directions. Now with your left hand, open your door and then put both hands back on the wheel." I complied as fear started to creep back in. I wasn't afraid because I did anything wrong, but I had never been in this sort of tense situation with the police before. My fatigue, the rainstorm, everything seemed to be conspiring against me. The officer continued to give me step-by-step directions until I was out of the car, and then he patted me down and pulled my wallet out of my back pocket. As he rifled through it, he found my driver's license. "You're Tim?" he asked. "Yes," I answered, a little sheepishly, wondering if I was in some kind of trouble. "Okay, Tim, so why don't you tell me and my partner what you're doing out here?" I called you guys because earlier I had picked up a woman to give her a ride, and then she refused to get out of my car. I didn't know what to do, and I didn't want to put my hands on her, so I called the police. "What was your intentions when you picked her up?" the second officer asked. "Just to give her a ride," I said, as the thunder rumbled closer now. It seemed to be blowing in off what appeared to be a lake beside where I had parked. "You give lots of women rides?" the first officer asked. I knew where this was going. The officer thought I was some sketchbag. He must not have been dispatched by the person I spoke to when I called in earlier. I figured I better just start from the beginning and accept that the night was going to get even longer, as I now needed to justify what I was doing there. Sorry for any misunderstanding. I work for a ride-sharing company. People use an app to request a lift, and if I'm in the area and available, I give them a ride. Earlier tonight, I picked up this woman that gave me a bit of trouble. I think she may have had some mental illness, or maybe was on drugs, because she acted very strange. She was talking to her handbag, and when we got here, she didn't get out. She just laid motionless on the back seat, clutching her bag. "What time did you pick her up?" asked the second officer. Instead of good cop, bad cop, these guys were playing bad cop, bad cop. Probably pissed off to be out in the rain on such a cold, stormy night. I told them that I had picked the woman up shortly after midnight. The first officer then asked where I picked her up from, and I told him. He looked at his partner and then back at me and said, "That's only about 25 kilometers from here. Did you stop anywhere else?" That was 4 hours ago. It would have taken 20-25 minutes tops for you to drive here from there. I was shaking pretty good now. I was waterlogged, and as cold as I was, I felt my face get hot and flushed as I tried to figure out what I could tell the officers so that I could go home. Amongst my fear and anxiety about the situation, anger started to creep in as well as I thought about the woman and how because of her I was in this situation. It was like a final F.U. from her. One last way to mess with me after ruining my night and stinking up my car. "What was this woman's name?" the second officer asked, and didn't seem pleased when I told him that I didn't know. "Her information is secure in the app, but for privacy, drivers and riders each use usernames and ID numbers. Their private information is logged in the system." I told them that I'd be happy to show them on the app, but I didn't have my phone. Lightning flashed behind me, and then a loud clap of thunder made me jump. I started thinking that we probably shouldn't be standing around in this storm, but the officers didn't flinch. The next few minutes were an exercise in frustration for all three of us as they pressed me for information I either didn't know, didn't have, or couldn't show them. They challenged my timeline and asked what house I rang the doorbell of when there weren't any houses anywhere near us. They were not impressed when I said I didn't have a supervisor they could call, that everything is through the app and by text and email. The second officer radioed a dispatcher and asked them to search up the app on the internet and try and find a contact number of someone who could verify my story. A second cruiser arrived and 2 more officers approached us on the side of the road. Apart from our 3 vehicles, there were no other cars or people out there. I realized that I wasn't even sure where I was. I had just kind of blindly followed the GPS, while most of my focus had been on the woman. The 2 other officers had their flashlights out and looked in and around my car. A female officer interrupted my roadside interrogation when she called out, Constable Jeffers, I think we've got something here." I turned my head to look behind my car to where she was standing, and then I followed the path of her flashlight to where it shone a short distance out into the water, revealing the woman's handbag as it floated offshore. My heart sank. What the hell was going on? Then I remembered the splash I had heard earlier. Was that the sound of the woman tossing her bag as she ran? Maybe, but the splash sounded like something bigger, heavier, and that went under the surface, not just smacked on top of it. At least the handbag proved part of my story. A little part of me hoped that the woman's phone was inside it and that it wasn't water damaged, so we could use it to show that she requested the ride using the app. I braced myself that the discovery of the bag was probably not going to do anything to help the situation. Then I heard the two officers from the second car discussing something, and it sounded like they were disagreeing about whatever it was. Then one of them called over and said that they were going to fish the bag out, but they were concerned about being in the water with the lightning so close by. The big burly officer that I now knew was Constable Jeffers said, "We better hold off. That's the last thing we need is for one of you to get zapped." I was barely able to keep my eyes open at this point and was staring at the puddles that pockmarked the ground around where I stood. The female officer that had discovered the bag floating in the water was now back to peeking in my windows with her flashlight. She circled the car from rear to front, all along the passenger side, and then started making her way down the driver's side, where I stood, leaning against my door. "Sir, please step aside," she commanded. I straightened up and took a couple steps forward as she crossed behind me. She stopped with her head pressed close to my window that was still rolled down and leaned inside, but quickly recoiled and told me to put my hands behind my back. The other officers swarmed me, and one of them said, "You are being detained while we search your car. You are not under arrest. Do you understand?" I said yes, and they put something similar to plastic zip ties on my wrists. "Do you consent to us searching your car?" "Sure," I said. I didn't really think that I had a choice, and I didn't have anything to hide. Constable Jeffers stood with me facing the car as the female officer opened my driver door, and then she showed her partner something. Through the rain, I could see what they were looking at. Their flashlights were fixed on the side of my headrest, and there was something dark red on it. Right away, I remembered the woman's hair flinging against my face, and my memory flashed to the glimpse that I got of her face that was covered in something that encircled her mouth and ran down her chin. I figured it was food, and that she was so disgusting that she probably had it in her hair too. I told the officer as much, but he didn't reply. Instead, we watched the female officer take out something and take a swab and then insert it into a vial. "We've got blood," she said. "Sir, you're under arrest and we're going to need you to come with us." That's about the last thing I remember before coming to in an interrogation room. I must have dozed off. Constable Jeffers was asking me questions about the woman and what my relationship to her was. I asked if they were able to contact anyone at the rideshare company, and he said yes, but the person they spoke to said that I hadn't picked anyone up for a ride last night. I shook my head no and said that was incorrect and desperately tried to think of where I could have dropped my phone. "Did you search my car?" I asked. "We did," Jeffers replied. "Any chance that you found my phone?" "We did," he answered. "But not in your car. It was in the bag that you threw in the lake, and you know what else we found in there, don't you?" I was stunned. "How did my phone get in the bag?" "No," I said. "To be honest, I don't." He then slid a file folder across the table towards me, and I cautiously opened it to find a stack of gruesome evidence photos. It was bits and pieces of human bodies, a few fingers, ears, and the last one was something that I will never forget for the rest of my life. It was a severed head. It looked like it had been chewed on by a dog or some sort of predator like a coyote. My stomach turned and the nausea came back tenfold. I hadn't eaten anything since around 6 p.m. and it was now 9:45 a.m. I dry heaved, despite my best efforts not to. In an unsympathetic voice, Constable Jeffers said, "Can you explain to us the bite marks on these?" "No," I said. "Dogs or coyotes? I don't know. I'm just going to cut right to the chase. Your phone was in the bag, in the lake, with all of those body parts and that head. All of the body parts, including the head, had bite marks on them, and from what we're being told, the bite marks are human, and you have dried blood on your collar, and in the back seat of the car, the front headrest, and even a little bit right there on your face. What kind of sick, depraved son of a are you? Where are the rest of the bodies? We got a dive crew about to get on the water. Are they going to find more body parts where we picked you up? I couldn't believe what was happening. I honestly thought I was having some sort of nightmare. Hey, I'm talking to you, said Jeffers, leaning in closer. Now, I listen to a lot of true crime, and one thing that gets repeated is never talk to the cops, regardless of whether you are innocent or not. Why didn't I think of this earlier? I had a sinking feeling as my mind replayed all of the things that I've already said to them that could be used to try and build some sort of case against me. I took a deep breath and muttered, I want to speak to a lawyer. Jeffers kicked his chair back and stood over me. I was pretty sure he was about to beat the crap out of me, but he just scoffed and said, okay, sicko, you want to lawyer up? That's on you. I can't help you now. He left the room and my heart raced, almost outpacing my mind that was reeling. Did I make a mistake? Should I have kept talking? I didn't know. I'd never even had a speeding ticket, let alone been interrogated for something as grotesque as biting or eating other human beings. I sat there for a few more hours alone, tired and mortified in that interview room, until the female officer from the side of the road came in. She read me my rights and said that she was going to take me for processing, and then I could make a phone call to schedule an appointment with a lawyer. That was just over 2 weeks ago, and here I sit, still in prison. My lawyer and I have been told that police have identified 4 separate victims from the body parts that were in the woman's handbag. The head belonged to Nadia Nyquist, who went missing about a month ago and was last seen entering her apartment. She apparently resided at one of the apartments in the fourplex where I picked up the psychotic, strange woman that set off this whole terrifying chain of events. So far, there isn't any link between any of the 4 victims, and they aren't names that I recognize, which I kind of think must be a good thing. The thing that just about broke me was that 2 days ago, a 5th victim was recovered. I was shown photos of a bloated corpse and asked who she was. I didn't know her name, but I was horrified when I realized that I knew her face. It was the woman. That sick psycho must have drowned herself after killing and eating those 4 poor people. Now we may never know why she did it. My lawyer told me that I should tell the police that the woman was the person I gave a ride to that night, and hope they can somehow tie her to the 4 victims. I told the police, but they told me that I was full of it, and asked me why her blood was all over my back seat, and why she had bite marks on her as well. I said she must have done it to herself before getting into my car. I have no idea what would make anyone do any of this. The cops say there was no blood on her from the other victims. I don't know if I believe them, but it actually wouldn't surprise me given my good fortune so far. She also had no ID on her and doesn't fit the profile of any missing persons, or so they say. I can't explain any more than what I've already stated about what happened that night. I don't know what happened in the missing hours from that night. I don't know why the woman's information isn't in the rideshare company's records or on my phone. I don't know how I ended up by the lake after knocking on the door of the house that the woman wanted to be dropped off at. I can't remember the address, which doesn't help much. I'm not going to go into details about how scary life is behind bars. The terror I felt that fateful night revisits me day and night in here. I desperately need to get out of here and to go home. I honestly don't know how long I can hang on. I know the cops think that I did it, and the way the media portrays me, it sounds like they've already made up their minds too. I've grown to be very suspicious of everyone and everything. I don't trust anyone anymore. I'm 90% sure that my cellmate is an undercover cop. He's tried to chat me up a few times to get me to talk, but I just try to keep quiet and to be as invisible as I can in here. I don't know how I'm going to pay for my lawyer. The whole reason that I started driving at night was to try to make some cash to pay off my student debts and to make ends meet, and so that's why I've laid this out for you. I know that you don't know me from a hole in the ground, except for what I've told you, but I beg of you to believe me. I am innocent, and I need you all to help me. Email your member of parliament and let them know that you demand justice for me. This could happen to you, and I hope that you can show me some kindness in hopes that if you were in my shoes, people would do the same for you. I feel like I'm going crazy, and this nightmare is never going to end. Thank you for your time, and please, please, please help me if you can. This could be you. If I've learned anything through this whole ordeal, it is to never trust anyone, because evil exists. When you least suspect it, it will come for you.